In the brutal winter of 1883, deep in the Dakota Territory near what would later become Bismarck, a former fur trapper named Isaac Coleman was building something his neighbors called foolish. The temperature had already dropped low enough to freeze breath mid-air, and Coleman was digging his homestead into the side of a hill. His nearest neighbor, a homesteader named Marcus Trent, about 3 miles east as the crow flies, told anyone who would listen that Coleman was wasting timber and effort on a design that would flood come spring melt or collapse under snow load. The other settlers in the scattered community, most of them a hard day's ride from one another, built their cabins the traditional way, above ground with chinked log walls and steep roofs to shed snow. They had brought these building methods from the east, from Minnesota and Wisconsin, places where timber was abundant and winters, though harsh, were manageable. But Coleman had spent nearly a decade trapping beaver and muskrat across the northern territories, sleeping in dugouts and watching how animals denned for winter. He had seen something the other settlers had not, something about the way the earth itself held warmth once you got below the frost line. When he tried to explain his thinking to Trent and the others at the trading post that fall, they looked at him like he had taken leave of his senses. The consensus was clear. Digging into hillsides was what desperate men did during gold rushes, not what serious homesteaders built for their families. Coleman had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1882 after his trapping days ended, bringing with him a young wife named Sarah and their infant daughter. He had filed a claim on a south-facing hillside with good drainage, a spot where a small creek ran year-round, about 50 yards downslope. The land had enough timber for building, but was far from the dense forests he had known up north. This scarcity made every tree count, which is partly why his neighbors thought his plan was wasteful. Traditional log cabins required massive amounts of timber, straight logs for the walls, smaller logs for the roof structure, and endless chinking material to fill the gaps. Coleman had wintered enough in traditional cabins to know their weaknesses. No matter how carefully you chinked the logs, wind found its way through. The corners where logs crossed were particularly troublesome, and the constant battle against cold meant feeding the fire day and night, consuming cords of wood that had taken weeks to cut, split, and stack. He had watched families burn through an entire winter's wood supply by February, leaving them to scavenge frozen deadfall in the worst of the cold. He had seen children huddled in every blanket the family owned, shivering in cabins where frost formed on the inside walls near the floor. The problem was not that people did not work hard enough. It was that the design itself fought against the cold rather than working with the land. The observation that changed Coleman's thinking had come during his last trapping season, when he had sheltered for 3 days during a blizzard in a shallow cave along the Milk River. The temperature outside had been cold enough to kill an unprotected man in minutes, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your lungs burn. But inside that cave, dug back maybe 15 feet into the hillside, the temperature had been tolerable enough to sleep without a fire. He had lain there in his bedroll, listening to the wind howl outside, and realized the earth itself was insulation. Not the frozen surface layer, but the deeper earth that stayed at a constant temperature year-round. He had seen the same principle in root cellars, how they stayed cool in summer and never froze solid in winter. The earth was a massive store of moderate temperature, and if you could get your living space in contact with it, you would not have to fight so hard against the extremes. When he tried to explain this to Marcus Trent, the man had laughed and said that sounded like something a man who had lived too long alone in the wilderness would think. Sarah Coleman, to her credit, had listened to her husband's reasoning and trusted his experience. But even she wondered privately if they were making a terrible mistake as winter approached, and their shelter was still half dug into the hillside. The social cost of Coleman's decision was not insignificant. The scattered homesteading community depended on mutual aid and shared knowledge. When a man marked himself as different, especially in ways that seemed to challenge common sense, he risked isolation. Other wives stopped by less frequently to visit Sarah, worried perhaps that association with foolishness might be contagious. At the trading post, conversations would quiet when Coleman entered, then resume in hushed tones after he left. He could feel the weight of their skepticism every time he rode out to buy supplies or trade for goods. His wife bore this burden too, feeling the subtle shift in how other women regarded her. There were moments, Coleman would later admit, when doubt crept in during the darkest hours before dawn. Was he risking his family's safety on an idea born from sleeping in caves? Was the collective wisdom of generations of cabin builders really so wrong? But every time he walked past a neighbor's cabin and saw the massive piles of firewood stacked against the walls, already diminishing though winter had barely begun, he felt confirmed in his path. Every time he visited a family and felt the drafts moving across the floor, saw the children clustered near the hearth because the far corners were too cold to sit in, he knew there had to be a better way. The mockery was a price he was willing to pay if his family could be warm and safe. Isaac Coleman began his construction in earnest during August of 1883, knowing he had perhaps 3 months before serious cold arrived. The first step was selecting the right hillside location, a south-facing slope with good clay soil beneath the topsoil and natural drainage to prevent water accumulation. He wanted the front of the structure to face south, catching whatever winter sun was available, while the back and sides would be dug into the hill. The logic was simple in his mind, though he struggled to articulate it to the skeptical neighbors. The earth would provide insulation on 3 sides, steady and constant, while the south-facing front would gather warmth during the day. It was like how a buffalo faces south in winter, turning its thick hide to the north winds while taking what warmth the sun offered. When he tried to explain this to a neighbor named William Schaefer, the man had shaken his head and said Coleman was comparing his family home to how a beast stands in a field, which seemed to prove his point about the plan being ill-conceived. Coleman started by excavating into the hillside, digging back about 12 feet and creating a space roughly 16 feet wide. The work was backbreaking, done with shovel and pickaxe when he hit hardpan. He hauled the excavated earth in a wooden barrow, using it to build up a berm on the downhill side. The depth mattered. He needed thick earth on 3 sides, at least 6 feet of soil between his living space and the outside air. A thin layer would not hold steady temperature, but a good thick mass of earth once you got past the frost line would stay at a temperature that never froze and never got hot. The timber he used was mostly local cottonwood and whatever pine he could find, not the massive straight logs required for traditional cabin walls, but smaller logs and beams for the roof structure and front wall. He felled perhaps 24 trees total, a fraction of what a conventional cabin of similar size would require. He used the straightest logs for the front wall frame, creating a structure that was part log wall and part earth berm. The front wall stood about 7 feet tall, with a door in the center and a single window to the south side to catch light. For the roof, Coleman built a structure of beams and smaller logs, then covered it with a thick layer of prairie sod. He cut the sod in strips, laying them grass side up over the wooden roof structure, creating a living roof that would eventually grow into a thick mat. The roof sloped gently back into the hillside, allowing it to shed rain and snow melt toward the front. The sod roof was inspired by the old sod houses some settlers built on the treeless prairie, but Coleman understood it served a dual purpose here. It was not just cheap building material, it was insulation, a thick blanket that would keep heat in during winter and cool in during summer. As the construction progressed through September and into early October, the skepticism from neighbors turned to outright mockery. Marcus Trent rode past one afternoon and called out asking if Coleman was building a home or a grave, since he seemed determined to bury his family in the earth. Another neighbor, Emil Vogt, suggested that Coleman might as well dig the whole thing deeper and save the effort of a separate root cellar, since his family would be living in one anyway. The wives exchanged comments about poor Sarah Coleman, married to a man who could not build a proper cabin, forced to live like a badger in a burrow. William Schaefer, who considered himself something of an expert on construction, having built 3 cabins in his lifetime, examined Coleman's work one afternoon and pronounced it unsound. The earth would not hold, he insisted. The walls would cave in, the roof would collapse under snow load, and come spring the whole thing would flood and wash away. He said these things with absolute certainty, the way men who have always done things one way cannot imagine another way might work. Coleman listened politely and went back to work, checking and rechecking his measurements, making sure the roof beams were sound, ensuring the drainage channels he had dug around the structure would carry water away from the excavation. By late October, the structure was complete. Coleman had built a door from split planks, fitted it with leather hinges he had made himself, and hung it true in the frame. He had built a hearth and chimney along the back wall, using stones from the creek bed mortared with clay. The interior space was roughly 12 feet deep by 16 feet wide, smaller than a traditional cabin might be. But the earthen walls made it feel substantial rather than cramped. The floor was packed earth that Sarah covered with woven mats, and eventually a few precious boards Coleman had traded for. They moved in during the first week of November, before the ground froze solid. Sarah arranged their few possessions, hung curtains she had sewn across the window, and tried to make the space feel like a home. Their daughter, just learning to walk, seemed to adapt to the space immediately, unbothered by its unconventional nature. But Sarah could not shake the feeling of living underground, even though the south-facing front was fully open and brought in good light during the day. She wondered what her family back in Wisconsin would think if they could see where she was living. The first test came during a moderately cold spell in mid-November, when temperatures dropped and stayed below freezing for several days. Coleman built a small fire in the hearth. Nothing like the roaring blazes his neighbors fed constantly. Within a few hours, the interior of the structure had warmed to a temperature where they could sit comfortably without heavy coats. More remarkably, when the fire burned down to coals overnight, the space stayed warm enough that they needed only their regular bedding, not the piles of blankets and furs that families in traditional cabins required. Coleman walked the 3 miles to Marcus Trent's cabin one afternoon during that cold spell, partly to borrow a tool and partly to observe. Trent's cabin, built with good tight logs and carefully chinked, nonetheless had a fire going that consumed half a log every few hours. The family was warm near the hearth but cool near the walls, and Trent mentioned he had already gone through a quarter of his winter wood supply. Coleman said nothing about his own experience, knowing it would sound like boasting, but the contrast was stark. His structure had used maybe 1/10 of the wood in the same period and maintained a more even temperature throughout. Coleman began to understand why his design worked through simple observation. A traditional cabin was like wearing a single layer against the wind. The logs provided some barrier, but the countless joints and gaps let air move through. His semi-buried homestead worked like wearing layers. The earthen walls were thick and steady, holding moderate temperature year-round. The sod roof kept warmth from rising straight up and escaping. The south-facing front gathered any available solar warmth during the day. And because 3 sides were in contact with Earth, the temperature inside was influenced by the ground's steady temperature, rather than the wildly fluctuating air. The Earth, deeper than a few feet, stayed at roughly the same temperature year-round, somewhere around the temperature of a cool spring day. In winter, that meant starting from a baseline far above freezing. Each element of Coleman's design served a specific function he had observed through experience. The thickness of Earth on 3 sides meant the temperature stayed constant, despite surface conditions. The south-facing exposure was deliberate. Winter sun came from the south, and even weak winter sunlight contained warmth. That warmth was held by the earth walls overnight, released slowly back into the living space. The sod roof was insulation and mass, holding heat or coolness depending on season, and the pitched roof sloping back into the hill ensured snow and rain would shed forward. Coleman had not studied engineering. He had simply spent years observing how the natural world worked and applying those observations to human needs. As November turned to December, weather patterns across the northern plains began to shift in ways that old-timers recognized. The Lakota and Mandan people in the region spoke of the winter to come with unusual concern in their voices. Trappers who had spent decades in the territory watched the behavior of animals and saw troubling signs. The beavers had built their lodges thicker than usual, with more layers of mud and sticks. The deer had grown winter coats early and heavy. The birds had migrated south in larger numbers and earlier than normal. By mid-December, these signs were confirmed. A series of brutal cold fronts began moving down from Canada, each one colder than the last. The temperature would rise briefly between fronts, giving hope, then plummet again to levels that made even hardened pioneers uneasy. Old Marcus Trent, who had weathered 15 winters in the territory, told his wife this felt different. The cold had a quality to it that worried him, a steadiness and depth that suggested the worst was yet to come. Families began rationing their firewood, realizing their winter supplies might not last if the cold persisted. Some homesteaders made desperate trips to the distant timber stands, trying to cut and haul frozen wood in temperatures that made the work dangerous. The historical freeze began in earnest during the first week of January 1884. The temperature dropped day after day, settling into a cold so severe that the air itself seemed to crackle. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Water thrown from a bucket would freeze before hitting the ground. The wind was constant, howling down from the north with nothing to stop it across the open plains. Inside traditional log cabins, families huddled near their hearths, feeding fires that consumed wood at an alarming rate. Marcus Trent's family wore every piece of clothing they owned, layered on their bodies. They draped blankets over the windows to cut the drafts. They hung canvas sheets from the ceiling to create a smaller space near the hearth that could be kept marginally warmer. Despite these efforts, frost formed on the inside walls near the floor. Their water bucket froze solid overnight, even sitting near the fire. Trent was burning through wood so fast that he began breaking apart furniture to feed the flames, knowing his carefully stacked woodpile was diminishing far faster than the winter was passing. His wife's hands were chapped and raw from the constant work of maintaining the fire. Their children's faces were pale and pinched with the relentless cold that seeped in no matter what they did. Inside the Coleman homestead, the experience was remarkably different. Isaac built a fire each morning and let it burn through the day. A modest fire that used perhaps 3 or 4 pieces of wood, split to a reasonable size. By afternoon, the interior temperature was comfortable enough that Sarah could do her household work without wearing her heavy coat. Their daughter played on the floor in her regular clothes, not bundled like she was headed outdoors. When the fire burned down to embers at night, the temperature would drop some, but it never approached freezing. The earthen walls, thick and constant, held the warmth that had built up during the day. The sod roof prevented heat from escaping upward. The steady temperature of the ground itself, something around 40 degrees or so, Coleman guessed, kept the baseline temperature far above the killing cold outside. They could hear the wind shrieking across the prairie, could hear it whistle past their door, but inside the sound was muted, distant, as if the storm was happening in another world. Coleman's firewood supply, which his neighbors had said would not be enough, was barely diminishing. He calculated he might use 1/10 of what a traditional cabin required, maybe less. The structure was working exactly as he had hoped, using the Earth's own steady temperature as a foundation and adding just enough fire to make the space genuinely comfortable. The moment of validation came during the second week of the freeze, when Marcus Trent appeared at Coleman's door on foot, having left his horse at home because the animal was too valuable to risk in the extreme cold. Trent's face was wrapped in scarves, his coat stiff with frozen breath. He knocked, and when Coleman opened the door, a rush of warm air from inside met the brutal cold outside in a visible clash. Trent stepped inside and stood there for a moment, not speaking, just feeling the difference. The contrast was visceral and immediate. Outside was a cold so severe it could kill. Inside was a warmth that felt like early spring. Trent unwrapped his scarves with stiff fingers, his eyes moving around the interior of the structure. He had mocked so thoroughly just months before. He saw Sarah Coleman working at her small table without a coat on. He saw their daughter playing on the floor, in nothing more than a dress and stockings. He looked at the hearth where a modest fire burned, nothing like the roaring blazes he was feeding day and night. He touched the earthen wall and felt that it was not frozen but cool, stable, alive somehow with the temperature it held. For a long moment, Marcus Trent said nothing. Then, in a voice stripped of pride, he said, "Isaac, I was wrong, dead wrong. I don't know how, but you built something that actually works." Coleman nodded, not with triumph but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had trusted his observations despite universal skepticism. He offered Trent coffee, which they drank while Coleman explained again the principles he had tried to describe back in the fall, principles that made sense now that Trent could feel them working with his own body. Word of Coleman's successful design spread quickly through the scattered homesteading community, accelerated by the crisis of the freeze. Other families, desperate and struggling, began to see that the strange half-buried structure on the hillside was not foolishness but innovation, born from careful observation. William Schaefer, who had been so certain the design was unsound, came by to examine the construction more carefully. Emil Vogt, who had joked about living like badgers, asked detailed questions about the excavation and the roof structure. Even the wives who had pitied Sarah Coleman began to admit that perhaps there was wisdom in what had seemed like madness. By the time the brutal cold finally broke in late January, the contrast in wood consumption was undeniable. Families in traditional cabins had burned through their entire winter supply and were scavenging desperately for anything that would burn. The Colemans had used maybe 1/5 of their modest woodpile. More importantly, they had been genuinely comfortable throughout the worst cold many settlers had ever experienced. The structure had been tested by conditions more severe than Coleman had anticipated, and it had performed better than he had hoped. The following spring and summer, 3 other families in the area built semi-buried homesteads modeled after Coleman's design. Marcus Trent was the first, choosing a hillside on his property and excavating with help from Coleman himself, who offered advice freely now that his concept had been proven. The Trent family moved into their new structure before the next winter and found the same results. Warm in winter with minimal firewood, cool in summer without the oppressive heat that made traditional cabins unbearable during August. William Schaefer built one for his grown son, who was establishing his own homestead, modifying the design slightly, but keeping the essential principles. By the winter of 1885, there were 5 semi-buried homesteads in the scattered community, and they all weathered that winter with ease compared to their conventional neighbors. The technique became part of the local knowledge, something experienced homesteaders would mention to newcomers. When asked about building, old-timers would say, "If you've got a good hillside with drainage, consider digging in like Coleman did. It saves timber, saves work cutting firewood, and keeps your family comfortable year-round." Coleman's original structure served his family for more than 2 decades. His daughter grew up in that earth-sheltered homestead, later telling her own children about the winter of 1884, when other families nearly froze while she played on the floor in comfort. When Isaac and Sarah eventually built a larger conventional home after their homestead prospered, they kept the original structure as a root cellar and storm shelter, roles it served perfectly for another generation. The design did not become universal. It required the right terrain and soil conditions, and many homesteaders lacked suitable hillsides on their claims. But in areas where the conditions were right, the principle of using earth as insulation became an accepted part of frontier building knowledge. Settlers learned that sometimes the wisdom passed down from other regions needed to be questioned, that the harsh conditions of the northern plains required adaptation and observation rather than blind adherence to tradition. Coleman's contribution was not just a building technique, but a demonstration that careful observation of natural principles could solve problems that tradition could not. The story of Isaac Coleman and his semi-buried homestead tells us something fundamental about how innovation happens and how wisdom develops. It began with one man who looked at the natural world and asked himself why animals and earth behaved the way they did, then had the courage to apply those observations to human problems. It continued through a period of skepticism and mockery, the social cost that innovators often pay when they challenge accepted practice. It was proven not through argument or persuasion, but through the undeniable evidence of a family staying warm and comfortable while others suffered, through the simple fact of drastically reduced firewood consumption that could be counted in cords saved. The validation came from the most severe test imaginable, weather conditions so brutal that they exposed the weaknesses of traditional methods and the strengths of Coleman's unconventional approach. And the legacy unfolded as other families, seeing what worked, adopted and adapted the technique to their own situations. The deeper lesson transcends the specific technique of semi-buried homesteads. It speaks to the pattern of innovation throughout human history, how progress often comes from people willing to observe carefully and think independently, even when their conclusions seem strange to others. Coleman was not an educated engineer or a trained architect. He was a trapper who had spent cold nights in caves and had the wisdom to ask himself what he could learn from that experience. His innovation worked because it was rooted in patient observation of how the natural world actually behaved, not in assumptions about how things should work based on tradition. The resistance he faced was not malicious but human. People default to what they know and what their community accepts, and anything different triggers skepticism. But reality has a way of settling arguments when the stakes are survival. When families are cold and running out of firewood, when children are suffering despite parents' best efforts, the question stops being whether an idea seems sensible and becomes whether it actually works. Coleman's half-buried structure answered that question definitively. This story resonates today because we still face the same fundamental dynamic. We still encounter situations where accepted wisdom is insufficient, where conditions demand new approaches, where someone has to be willing to think differently and endure skepticism until results prove the concept. We still benefit from people who observe the natural world carefully and ask themselves what principles they can apply to human needs. The frontier is gone, but the pattern continues in every field where innovation matters. And we honor that pattern by remembering these stories, by keeping alive the accounts of people like Isaac Coleman, who solved impossible problems with nothing but careful observation, practical experimentation, and the courage to build something different even when neighbors thought them fools. These stories remind us that wisdom is not just what we inherit from the past, but what we discover through engagement with the present, that real knowledge comes from the willingness to test ideas against reality rather than defending them with tradition. If you value keeping these stories alive, if you want to honor the ingenuity and determination of people who built new lives in impossible conditions, consider subscribing to this channel and sharing these narratives with others who appreciate practical wisdom from the past. There are countless stories like Coleman's waiting to be told, accounts of frontier innovation that deserve to be remembered and respected. Leave a comment if you know similar stories from your own family history or regional heritage. These memories matter because they connect us to people who faced extraordinary challenges and solved them through observation, adaptation, and sheer human determination. Together we can preserve the legacy of those who came before and built the foundation we stand on today. Isaac Coleman's semi-buried homestead stands as a testament to the power of looking at old problems with fresh eyes, of trusting experience over convention, and of having the courage to build something different when you know in your bones it will work. That kind of wisdom, born from the earth itself and proven in the hardest winter Montana territory had seen, is worth remembering.